So thank you to Farm and Connect for letting us A, do this project, and B, letting us present the results to everybody. I'd much rather have been doing this up the Royal Welsh over a pint, but unfortunately that's how things are just now. So hopefully next year we can come back to it. But so yeah, we did a study on my client's farm, and it was comparing different methods of trace element supplementation for store lamb growth. That is the Welsh title, and unfortunately I'm embarrassed to say that I'm not sure how to say that. So before I go into the actual trial itself and what we did and what we found, I thought I should maybe just do a little bit of background on the trace element topic. It seems to be one of those quite hot topics. It's probably up there with COVID, the weather, silaging, Brexit. You know, there's a lot of sort of myths and truths that go around about trace elements and their relevance to growing lambs. But actually, we do find, particularly in our practice, our area of Wales and Monmouthshire, that trace elements do play a big role in this, particularly cobalt, selenium, and copper is one that I'll mention as well. So cobalt is used by the rumen microbes to produce vitamin B12. This is then part of the reaction for energy metabolism. So without cobalt, we can't make the vitamin B12. The lambs can't make the vitamin B12, so they can't produce energy to put growth on. It's something actually ruminants use far more cobalt than others, and it's more of an issue in sheep than it is in cattle. We don't routinely test for it in cattle. Selenium would be the next most common one that we see. A lot of people think of it in white muscle disease, but it is actually a big cause of poor growth rates. It's part of the antioxidant and immune function. That's really its role in the body, but still important for growth. And then copper. Copper is really important for a lot of enzyme reactions that occur and part of energy metabolism. So if you don't have the copper there, the reactions can occur and growth can happen. So really deficiencies in any or all of these will mean that you're going to get poor growth rates out of your lambs, and some of them can be fatal. But just as a note, I just would like to make it clear, as much as trace elements are important, there is other big causes of poor growth in your lambs. So worm burdens would be the most common finding, and sometimes they go along with trace element deficiencies. Just general lack of nutrition, this is quite an important one, and it comes into a slide later. You know, it doesn't matter if you can have all the trace elements in the world there, but if you're not actually giving them enough grass or hay, then actually it's irrelevant. And things like underlying conditions, so pneumonia is a big one, particularly in store lambs, that if they've had issues with pneumonia in the past, you are going to knock growth rates. So I thought I would just sort of show you the sort of spread of where we see trace element deficiencies. A lot of these trace elements are found in the soil. So deficiencies in the soil and the grazing platforms will mean that you have deficiencies in lambs potentially. So this is data from APHA's Vet Gateway, and their sheep surveillance page is open to everyone. It's not a vet-only page. It's very useful just to show you distributions. So this is 2019 data for cobalt deficiency, which is commonly known as PINE. So last year, APHA had 71 diagnoses of cobalt deficiency. The green areas, so a lot around Wales, Scotland, where I'm from, it's particularly bad for cobalt deficiencies. You know, so it's quite widespread, and actually this is APHA only data. There's quite a few labs that would test for these things. We use Axiom. When I spoke to them, they said last year they had 94 submissions, so it's quite widespread, and there is other labs out there. But just bear in mind, so cobalt in APHA was the fourth biggest diagnosis that they had in lambs. Worms, which is parasitic gastroenteritis, is much higher, so it's 263, so do always remember that. And when you look at selenium, so the spread of selenium deficiency in 2019, it's a fairly similar picture. Not quite so many cases, so 57 APHA, Axiom had 23, a little bit less common in Wales, but still quite heavily in Scotland. And then finally moving on with copper. So this is something that I probably don't talk much more about as we go through, but you can see a big difference here with the low coppers that we see. It's they only had 12 cases or diagnoses in APHA, and it's very sparse across the UK. It's only really North Scotland and north of Wales. And I really wanted to highlight here was there was 12 cases of low copper. There was actually 11 cases of copper poisoning. So we do see a lot of farmers supplementing without knowing what's really going on with their lambs and supplementing copper. And then actually what happens is you poison the lambs with copper. You know, and copper poisoning is just as common as copper deficiency. So one big point I would take from this is to speak to your vet about your trace element status, you know, using the Farm Connect clinics to get a diagnosis, because if you don't need copper, you shouldn't be supplementing it. So it's really important to get it right. So that's sort of the background. So if we move on to the trials. So Guy and Kathy Parry from Pentre had approached myself and Farm Connect to see whether, you know, there'd be any funding to help them do a bit of a trial, because they wanted to have a little look at their, you know, at trace elements, and they have got quite a good setup for it. So we did this sort of on-farm trial comparing. So what we did was monthly oral supplementation of a trace element. So we gave lambs monthly the Wednesday Olvet drench. And then we compared this to groups, which one group had a slow release trace element bolus. So that was a downland essential lamb bolus. And then the other group had trace sure boluses. And then what we wanted to compare with these was blood analysis of the trace elements and then their live weight gain. And this was done in non-homebred animals. But why did we want to do this? So as I said, it's a big hot topic, trace elements, but we do find there is a massive number of products on the market. Great sales data go with all of them, but you know, you've got licks, you've got drenches, you've got boluses, and you've got different types of boluses, pasture dressing, injectables. And there's not a massive amount of data behind how effective these things are. And for Guy and Kathy, they wanted to know, you know, their store lamb, they're purchasing these store lambs, what's actually most cost effective for them and what's their system, and useful for others to know. So how we actually did this trial. So Guy and Kathy buy in a lot of store lambs, usually through the late autumn right through into winter. They will say themselves they buy what we call the second class stores, so they do buy really quite poor looking lambs because they know they can treat them right and get them where they need to be, so they can make a decent profit off these. So they bought 156 store lambs. They checked with vendors that they hadn't been supplemented with any trace elements prior to purchase and that they hadn't really had anything, which none of them had. So then what we did was we split them into 3 groups. So one group, they were all spray marker dependent on the group. So the red group were given the Olvet drench. So as we go through these slides, you'll see that there's always red bars, yellow bars and purple bars, so they always match what they had. So the red group had the Olvet mineral drench. We then had the next group were the yellow group, they had the downland bolus, and then the purple group had the trace sure boluses. So we split them into their 3 groups, and then within the 3 groups, then we picked out 5 as randomly as possible. We picked out 5 animals. They were then numbered 1 to 5 with their colours. So there was yellow 1 to 5, red 1 to 5, purple 1 to 5, and they were selected for blood sampling, so as I could follow the same 5 through the trial. So I think I have a picture of that. Yes. So surprisingly, yellow works quite well, and we were a bit concerned about that. But you can see we've got 3, 5 in red, 1 in red. So we follow these ones. So what we did was on day 1 with these lambs, we split them into the groups. I blood sampled my 5 from each group. All 156 of them were weighed, and this was recorded. And then through the trial, so 6 weeks later, which was the 21st of December, we repeated the blood samples and we weighed them again. And then we did that again at the end of the trial, which was the 31st of January. When we hit the end of January, these sheep were going to go on to some concentrate just to finish them off. So we stopped the trial because we thought that might skew our results. The 156 lambs were also kept in one grazing pasture together. No other sheep or cattle were on there with them, so we hope that will keep it sort of similar. You know, this farm at Pentre is one we know has issues with cobalt. So that's really how we did the trial. And so what did we find? Oh, I forgot to mention, sorry, we were hoping that in an ideal world, we would have done a group that was completely unsupplemented, but we decided for welfare issues, you know, if they were going to have low cobalts or seleniums, that it was a bit of an issue. And also Guy and Kathy didn't want to be losing, you know, any live weight or anything due to the trial by knowing that they hadn't supplemented anything. So on to the findings of what we found with this result. So first of all was our blood results, and I thought these were really interesting. Maybe that's just because it's me and I like these sorts of things. But particularly when we looked at cobalt, so this table here, hope you can understand it. So this is the red group, so these are the bloods that were done before the trial started, so before they had any supplementation, the middle of the trial, and then the last blood sample, and the red group along here, yellow and purple. So as you will notice, before we give any of these lambs any trace elements, significant numbers of groups were actually deficient in cobalt. So 3 of the 5 animals that I blood sampled, those red 1 to 5s, were low in cobalt, 2 in both the yellow and the purple groups. So actually 46% of the lambs in this trial, if we escalated up the numbers, were actually cobalt deficient. And I thought that was quite important because these are store lambs, and obviously the previous person wasn't getting the weight on these lambs to get them close enough to finishing, that they could finish them themselves. And there's a fair chance that actually it's because they were cobalt deficient was why they weren't getting anywhere with them. So that's definitely something that's a take home for them. But then as we look through the trial, you'll notice that in the middle of the trial, once they've been supplemented, so this was 6 weeks later, none of the lambs were deficient in cobalt in any of the groups, and the same right at the very end of the trial, none of them were deficient. So overall, that we found that it didn't matter what we supplemented them with, whether it was an oral drench, a bolus, you know, either of the 2 types of boluses, their cobalts improved and remained improved for the entirety of the project. With our selenium findings, I didn't put in the table, we didn't have any deficiencies at the start of the trial or at any point through the trial in any of the sort of 15 lambs that were blood sampled. And with copper, there was 1 or 2 elevations, but very, very mild, and it was various lambs throughout the trial. I think it was only 4 lambs. We do generally find when we're blood sampling lambs, we do find the odd copper elevation. It's quite often just due to underlying inflammation. So whether it's a little bit of pneumonia, whether it's a bit of lameness, they can be very mildly elevated, and that really fitted with what we found is some of them were just, you know, it could just mean that they were a bit lame. So we tended just not to concern ourselves with these. Just to make note, the drenches and the supplements, the boluses we were using, none of them had any excess copper in them. They're only cobalt, selenium and iodine boluses. The next parameter then that we looked at was their average daily live weight gain. You know, this is the main thing we're after. We want to get these lambs up to finishing as quick as possible and as efficient as possible. So how I've laid this table out, I'm hoping it makes sense to you. So again, I've stuck to my colours. My red is my drench, yellow is my downland bolus, purple is my tracer. So this column here is looking at the live weight gains from November to December, first part of the trial. The second one is the second part of the trial, from December to January, and then the third one here, this is overall across the trial right through from the November to January. So I think without even looking actually at the trace elements individually, one thing that I thought was very important was the difference between the first part of the trial, where the daily live weight gains were fairly good. You know, we were up in the high 100 grams per day, you know, 184 grams per day, which isn't too bad going. But when we got to the second part of the trial, the average daily live weight gain dropped significantly into levels where it's not really where we should have it. You know, it's way down at 74, 55. So this was something for Guy and Kathy to look at and think, do maybe in the future we need to start feeding these a bit sooner, because, you know, they're not making what they should be. So we thought that was quite important. it was really a wet winter this year, so we think that the grazing platform probably was struggling by this point in the year. Then when we separate it down into in our separate trace elements, it was actually interesting that the downland group did the best. So the ones with the downland bolus did the best overall. You know, in the first part of the trial, they were making 184 grams a day, above, you know, our drench and our trace element, and our trace sure, sorry. In the middle of the trial, it is significantly better than the other two groups, which were much further back. And overall, the daily live weight gain on the downland was 129 versus trace sure bolus, which actually did the poorest at 115 grams. So actually, on average, the lambs in the downland group finished 1.2 kilos heavier than those that would have been in the trace sure group. And looking at prices for our sort of old season lambs, sort of last January, January 2020, that means that the lambs that were in the downland group were making an extra £2.64 ahead of those that would have been in the trace sure group. So it's, you know, money wise, that's quite important. One other factor that I thought I'd make note of was actually the death rates in the group. We didn't post-mortem any of these, just purely time. By the time they found the lambs as well, then it may have been they would be too far gone. But we did find that there were 7 lambs died overall in the project. All of them actually died within the first 6 weeks of the project, so nothing died after December. But of the 7, 4 of them were in the downland group, 2 were in the trace sure group, and 1 was in the drenching group. We could make assumptions of why they died. You know, was it they were just poor and they struggled? You have got the element when you're doing bolusing. Was there a bolus gun injury? That wasn't noted, but we didn't post-mortem them. So just something to think about. And then so overall, you know, what we were looking at is what's going to be the most cost-effective bolus or a cost-effective trace element supplement. And I'm not sure we really answered the question with this one when we've spoken about it since. But you know, when we split the pricing down, so we have the drench here. You know, the technology study, they absorb that. The downland bolus is what they call erosion boluses. Trace sure are what they call leaching boluses. These are 2 different actions. When you look at the price, so this line here is the actual cost of the drench or the boluses. So drenching is significantly cheaper. It works out at 7.2p a head for the entire project, versus the 53 pence and the 85 pence of the boluses. What we do have to remember with drenching is that we had to do this monthly, which is a little bit labour intensive, and you've got to remember that farmers never account their time, but actually if you work out, the minimum wage is £8.72 an hour, so you've got to tally up how much time would you spend bolusing them and then include that in the figure. So that then pushes this figure up a little bit. And also when you're monthly gathering these animals, you are then adding stress onto the lambs, so you may predispose them to other diseases such as lameness, pasteurellosis, pneumonia. So you may flare up other things, which is in comparison to our 2 sets of boluses, which licenses claim they will last up to 120 days. And actually in our trial over 12 weeks, they did seem to stand up to our blood sampling. So you've only got to handle them once, and then that's then done theoretically. And then when you look down, so that was the pricing, you know, our average daily live weight gains, as I've already said, the downland group did much better than both the trace sure and the mineral drenching. So, you know, these lambs in this group here were on average making £2.64 more than the trace sure group, and slightly less when, you know, with the mineral group. But then if we're tallying it in, you've got to include the price of the deaths of the lamb. You know, they could be coincidental, but more lambs did die in the downland group. So I think what we took from that when I spoke to Kathy and Guy, you know, we've sort of weighing up what's going to be the most appropriate for them. And when you're looking at your own farm, is what's the most appropriate for your system. You know, for Kathy and Guy, they've thought actually in future they probably will use the downland boluses. You know, price-wise, they are cheaper than the trace sure boluses, and actually they've done much better in growth rates when they've been on the downland bolus. For them, the drenching, although it's much cheaper, it's an awful lot more labour, an awful lot more handlings. And when you've got other, they've got commercial cattle there as well, they don't have the time for handling them so often, and they didn't want to risk the stress of them. But equally, they have said maybe if you're going to have shorter keep lambs possibly in future, are they going to start feeding them much quicker, so that, concentrate feed will supplement with trace elements, and they have said maybe they will just do a group with a mineral drench. So what is probably brought up is trying to work out what's been most cost effective for them, but also what works practically for them. As much as the mineral drench is cheaper, actually there's a lot more handling costs that are involved with that. So just really to wrap up, so the conclusions that I brought from this trial, I don't know if anyone else might agree with me, but trace element deficiencies are an important cause of poor growth. If you think back to my slide where I showed you the blood analysis of the cobalt levels before we gave them anything, nearly half of the lambs were cobalt deficient. These were store lambs that people were having to sell because they couldn't get them to weight. And there's a fairly significant reason why. Within this trial, it didn't matter really what we supplemented with, whether it be a bolus, a drench. It improved all our cobalt levels, or vitamin B12 at our cobalt levels. It didn't see selenium, so it may be a different picture with selenium, and boluses all have different claims, so it's something that needs to be looked at. It really did highlight to us that, and for you guys as well, if you're doing store lambs, if you're doing your own homegrown lambs, we're going through the growth season, all systems and farms are different. You may have a trace element problem, you may not have one, but you really need to speak to your vet, and get a good idea of what's going on with them. The biggest waste of money would be to be giving your lambs boluses or drenching them all the time to find out actually you don't have a trace element problem. So even if you are mineral drenching them and you don't need to be, you're wasting, up over 10 pence a lamb as well as your own time. So, there's plenty of sheep vets out there, and we enjoy our sheep work, and there's plenty of us out there to speak to them. They're really interested, and they will look into it for you. So you want to get some trace element testing done if possible. And again, there is the Farm and Connect clinics, so the money is there. And then what I thought was really important was actually monitoring the progress of what you do. And we've got a few clients who are doing this now, again, probably slightly thanks to Farm and Connect with these clinics is, if you do find that you've, say, got low cobalt issues and then you decide to do a bolus that may not be within this trial, is to bolus them and then test them later, or follow their live weights. It's interesting to see how much live weight they're actually making, because you may not find necessarily they're looking poor, but they might not just be doing what you're expecting them to do. They're not finishing as quick as you are. And I think in the sheep industry, I think there's a lot of us are maybe not keeping up with keeping on top of live weights and recording what we find. Even if you make your recordings, ask your vet to have a look at them. We're more than happy to. We're happy to do a quick bit of maths and work out if you're getting those growth rates that you should be. And then, last of all, is I would say, don't try and do a trial on grazing lambs and the wettest winter on record. So we did this it was pretty wet. There was a lot of miserable times walking around sheep and trying to get them penned up, and blood sampling in the rain. Everyone's wet and miserable, but to be fair, at the end of the day, we all had a smile on our face, and we were very pleased to do this. So I'd just like to thank sort of everybody in this list here, particularly Farm and Connect and Elan for helping out, and the Parries. They were really useful, and I think they really enjoyed it as well, and to everyone else. So I think that's all from me. So I hope I've managed to give you something useful, and any questions that you have, hopefully I can answer them.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Vicky. Diolch yn fawr iawn. That was interesting results to come out of that trial. I think you're definitely right saying that trace elements are a hot topic. They seem to be something that farmers are really interested in. But like you said, it's important. Not all farms are the same. It's important for farmers to speak to their vets, and really, this is a trial that any farmer that can do on their own farm. It's not a one size fits all. What works for one farm might not work for another. So definitely it is a sort of trial that you can do on your own farm. So with those few words, I'd like to open up the floor if there are any questions. Nothing's come through yet, but please do type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you do have any questions, and we'll get them answered before we bring the webinar to a close. And you might get away with it quite easily, Vicky, I'm not sure, if no questions come through. Just while we're waiting for if there are any questions then, I'd just like to remind you again, the presentation has been recorded and will be uploaded to the Farm and Connect website in a few days. So if there's anything that you've missed or wanted to look at the graphs and diagrams again, you're more than welcome to look back at the presentation. And at the bottom and at the end of the webinar as well, there will be an evaluation form for you to complete. So if you could take 2 minutes of your time just to complete the evaluation form, just to let us know what you thought of the webinar and how we can improve for the future, that would be very much appreciated. So I think we have got a few questions that's come through now then. So if I read them out and if you can try and answer them, Vicky, that would be much appreciated. So is it worth thinking that there is deficiency of trace elements and to use cheap dose anyway?
It's one of those, it is worth getting some testing done, because long term, if you're keeping your own homebred animals, if you're seeing them right through the summer, is it worth you doing monthly drenching? And again, it's what you need. If you turn out that actually you do need copper in amongst there, then it's getting a drench that does involve copper. Equally, if you don't need copper, you don't want copper in there. You will also think that some of the white wormers, if you are doing any nematodiary treatments, your sort of first treatment for your lambs, some of them will actually already contain cobalt and selenium anyway, so they will actually be getting a little boost around them. It is quite individual to situations. So it's probably worth speaking to your vet regarding that. So yeah, that's probably my roundabout answer to that question.
Yeah, I think that's quite important to note, really. It's, you might find out that you don't have any deficiencies, and then you could save cost and time by not supplementing them with trace elements. So yeah, I think that's a very important point. Just speak to your vet and make use of the animal health clinics that Farm and Connect have to offer as well. They're there for Farm and Connect registered businesses, so make good use of them. Another question then that's come through, what's your thoughts on feed mineral buckets and free access mineral versus boluses?
My issue with free access and lick buckets, how do I describe it to my clients? Like peanuts on a bar. When you go into a pub or there's Go Crisps on the bar, and there's crisps on the bar, and you've got the person who sits next to them and has constantly got their hand in the crisp and are eating all of them. There's the odd person that when they go for a drink, they might have a crisp, and then there'll be people who don't eat any crisp at all. It's the same analogy with lambs in a mineral bucket. You've got no control over how much they're getting. So some might take it, others might have loads of it. You haven't got really any control of how much they're getting. I do find it quite expensive for what they are. There's probably cheaper ways of doing it, and you have just got to watch. A lot of them are molasses based, so molasses is essentially sweeties to people. So any of us with a sweet tooth are quite understanding of how much you would go with that bucket if it tasted nice and sweet. So I'm not a massive fan of lick buckets. Minerals, that go on top of hay or, that you mix in with feed are fairly good if they're mixed in at the right dose rates. But yeah, I'm not a fan of lick buckets personally. That's my personal opinion on those.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. Not a question now, but just a comment saying very interesting project, and thank you very much. And then the next question, what's the difference between erosion and leaching bolus? Would one suit some farms more than others?
It's just the different ways that they break down within the rumen. So obviously the boluses land in the rumen and they've got to sit there theoretically for the 120 days of what they claim. So leaching boluses, like the tracer ones, they're basically designed that they just sort of dissolve, they react in the rumen, and they just constantly leave out a very amount of trace elements every day, they tend to then swell up, and then they're released once they're essentially done. The eroding boluses, in theory, they sort of just dissolve, and quite often you give two of them and they sort of knock against each other and they break down. Theoretically, they are meant to be a little bit more unstable, would probably be the word, but actually in our project, the downlines were the eroding boluses, they actually did better. It's really just to do with the technology of how they degrade. So it's not really that they would be better for one farm or the other. It's really just the technology that the companies have sort of used to get the trace elements out of them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Another question then is, what is your opinion on collated trace element doses that claim they are protected and last longer?
It depends which companies you're using. You've got to watch some of the collated ones that actually they can't actually absorb them properly. So the claiming they would last much longer, I would just see as the data there to support them. You know, as vets, we like to test things. You know, if you read the data on the trace sure, then theoretically it's meant to release things better. But in our project, they did do what they expected on the bloods, but they didn't give us the growth rates.
Yeah, thank you. If ewes are given trace element bolus pre-tupping, how long are these staying in them? We're using a single 12-month bolus, so I assume we should bolus them pre-tupping every year. Also, does the effect transfer to lambs? And if so, how long will it help the lambs?
Definitely a good idea to give the boluses pre-tupping if you do require some trace elements, you know, that as well as for growth. Trace elements are quite important for fertility. Generally, I am not aware of any boluses that claim they last 12 months. The data, when, you know, I'm part of Excel Vets and we've got quite a few people have done some studies on some of these, even the ones that say they last 6 months, it's up to 6 months, and some of the data is fairly shaky on whether they even last 6 months. So I think if you give them the pre-tupping, you definitely do, you know, they should stay through tupping time. Really what you want to do is get her pregnant and sustain a pregnancy. So, you know, a bolus will do that with her. They probably are lasting through to lambing time. You know, some people will then do something pre-lambing to make sure that they're getting trace elements, but just beware that if you're bolusing anything pre-tupping, if you're giving any concentrate feed, you know, if you've got twins and triplets, there will be trace elements in there. So we have a lot of clients who'll do pre-tupping boluses, but then they've got cake going into their ewes prior to lambing, so they will be getting supplemented, and then your selenium comes through the milk then into the lambs. So as long as they're drinking milk, they're getting some form of supplementation, but you've just got to watch once lambs sort of hit 60 weeks, their milk intake is very low.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to say exactly how long the lambs will be protected, because like you said, some boluses claim up to 6 months, up to however many months. So it's probably hard to say an exact figure, I would have thought. And then the last question I think we've got is, I keep swale dales on the Llŷn Peninsula and the lambs are a struggle to keep weights on over the winter. I am feeding creep throughout until winter this year. They don't bloom till the spring grass arrives. Then they bloom. Do you think this could be a trace element issue? I feed mineral buckets and they love it.
I think this is something you probably want to speak to your own vet about. You know, is there other issues going on the farm? You know, is it when they're out in winter, what sort of grazing are they on? Is there any supplemented like hay or anything like that if they're lacking grass? You know, our trial, we hit between December and January, the growth rates dropped, but they still had trace elements going on. You know, they supplemented from what we saw. And they weren't hitting them. So I'd be suspicious whether it's what they're eating, if they're being creep fed all the way through, are they on ad lib, or is it it's something you want to speak to your vet about, you know. But there might be other underlying issues, like a sort of fluke issue that's underlying and that's knocking their condition. You know, it's definitely, I would speak to your vet about that one. And it's quite important because you don't want knocking growth through winter. You should go back a little, but you know, if they're really struggling.
Brilliant. That is the end of the question and answer session. So yes, I think if there aren't any more questions, I'll bring the webinar to a close by saying thank you very much, Vicky, for joining us. Diolch yn fawr iawn, and for giving us such a great presentation. And you know, I know it's hard to squash all that information into 20 minutes or half an hour. I'm sure you could go on all day about trace elements, but I think you did a very good job. So thank you very much.